I had actually meant to do this on Veterans Day, but that kind of fell through. So instead, for Thanksgiving, we're going to celebrate with some good old World War II. And what better way to do it is than the franchise that kind of started the World War II craze, as well as got me into World War II games in the first place. And that's Medal of Honor, and we're going to rank them. I actually had played the original, not quite when it came out, but pretty close. I rented it. I think I played through about half the game. I enjoyed it, but like it kind of got. It was kind of advertised as like the GoldenEye for PlayStation 1, and that it's not. Now, don't get me wrong, it was still a pretty good game. Probably one of the best, if not the best, FPS the PlayStation had, but there was just something that GoldenEye and Perfect Dark had that Medal of Honor didn't, and at the time I didn't really know much about World War II, and so it didn't really grip me back then. And then I played Frontline, and by then I had more knowledge of that era. And when I played Frontline, I was like, oh wow, I'm actually enjoying this. And then I started exploring more World War II themed stuff, and that led me to play the rest of the series, including Allied Assault and Underground, which I had previously missed. And then going in to try Call of Duty later on, and the Wolfenstein games. So yeah. Anyways, let's start with that original title that I experimented with back when I was a kid. The original Medal of Honor for PS1. And while I did say that my first experience I enjoyed it, but I didn't think too much of it, when I went back and played it again and played it through to completion, I definitely had a better appreciation for it. It definitely was a bit different. Well, actually, Underground and Frontline, and to an extent, the original Medal of Honor were a bit different than the later ones, since they were special forces infiltration type games as you're playing with the working for the OSS in those games. So I guess it was kind of like a 007 for World War II in some ways. It usually was straightforward shooting, but every now and then you did have to play with some gadgets and do with some unconventional objectives. But it did look fairly good for the system at its time. The soundtrack was something you hadn't really seen in video games back then. It definitely started, well, maybe not started, but it definitely kind of was the first of video games starting to adopt movie-esque soundtracks, which I think for World War II that's fine, but then you start getting things that just why? Why are we having movie soundtracks in these games? But I won't begrudge it for it. Supposedly they were trying to make sort of a Saving Private Ryan in video game format. At least that's what I had heard when I'd watched the documentary on the series. I don't know if it's true, but I have no reason to disbelieve it. They did a pretty decent job with what the technology they had. Obviously, they couldn't have big NPC fights and infantry kind of the big infantry fights you had seen in later games or in Call of Duty. But for what it is, it's solid. The campaign is done pretty well. There are some things you really hadn't seen back in the day. There's a variety of the objectives you did and the ways you went about doing them. But nobody expected to do the undercover missions. And for that, I think it deserves an A, because it's solid, it holds up well, and it set the series up for a decent amount of success. Now, Underground was more of the same. It was a prequel to the first game, and while it is good and it does use most of the same mechanics that the first one did, this one lit a little bit off the rails. Like later on, you go through storm a castle full of Germans, and then you get guys in freaking medieval armor swinging swords at you, and I'm just like, really? Really now. I guess we're throwing any sense of realism out the window. Not that it really had that much to begin with, but come on now. I do appreciate they added a few new weapons to it, like the STG 44. And this was one of the first times you'd seen allied NPCs that actually fought with you instead of just ran out and died. That were very few and far between. There are only like a couple of missions where that happened, and usually like one NPC at a time, but back then that was probably pretty impressive. It did lose a bit of the wow factor the first game had, and just the level design wasn't as interesting, and as I said before, it did get a bit outlandish at times, so for me this was a B. As long as you don't play that Game Boy Advance part. If that was on the list, that'd be an instant F tier. It's terrible. Avoid it. I couldn't even play through like a couple levels before I was like, nah, I'm not playing this shit. And next we have Frontline. I'm going to be honest, I have a lot of nostalgia for this game, and it's going to be hard to judge this one fairly. Because this is the first time I really got into a World War II game, and it got me into the series. And looking at it objectively, it may not be as good as, say, Allied Assault, even though it was released at the same time, but of like the classic style games where you're just playing as the one dude doing OSS stuff. It plays pretty similar to the first two, and I think it did it the best. They did a bit more with having allies fighting with you, though those were still few and far between, but there was at least more than one of them. The only serious gripe I have with it is kind of stupid that you only get like the Garand for the first couple of missions and then it just disappears. And like that was kind of a key component of the American forces back in the day, so why are we doing that? And it was a bit more linear and straightforward than the previous games were. And like the infiltration missions were, the undercover missions were a joke. You'd spend about a couple of minutes undercover, then instantly having it blown. So I kind of wonder why I was in there in the first place. But as far as the shooting goes, this is about as good as the first two. Did a great job of taking the series into, well, I don't want to say HD because it wasn't HD, but into the next generation. And, you know, I'm just going to put it in an S. It was that fun for me. Though I will say anybody looking to play it might want to look into that PS3 HD version if you can. Anyways, Allied Assault. This was the PC, the first outing on the PC, and I believe this came out before Frontline did. If not, that they were pretty close to each other. This one's kind of an in-between before the old school style infiltration OSS style games and the newer ones which were more infantry focused. You definitely had more missions with allies in them than Frontline did, but it was still kind of like every now and then, and usually it was only a couple of soldiers with you. But shit, mechanic wise, this was pretty top tier back in the day. And this is one of the few games where I actually gave a crap about the multiplayer. I spent a pretty good amount of time with another buddy of mine just playing Team Deathmatch and Capture the Flag. We had a lot of fun on that. And the campaign is also pretty solid. I generally don't have much negative to say about it. Like, campaign was great, the mechanics were good, it looked fairly decent for its time. Did a great job of reusing the soundtracks for the old games and putting some new ones in there. The sound design was solid. Like, I can't think of a single negative thing to say about it, so in S tier it goes. And honestly, it's probably the best the series has ever been. Now, it did get 2 expansion packs. The first one, Spearhead, that one is really, really hard to judge. Because on one hand, the content you got out of it was, like, sparse. It added a handful of new maps, character skins, and weapons to the multiplayer. I never played around with Spearhead, Spearhead's multiplayer, at least not by itself, so I can't judge the quality of that. But the campaign, oh man, was that short. You had about 3 missions with the British in Normandy, doing on the paratrooper side of it instead of through D-Day, through the beachhead like Allied Assault's base game. And then you had 4 missions in Bastogne with the Americans, and then 2 missions into Germany with the Russians. So that's about 9 total. Yeah. You could easily finish this in about 2 to 3 hours depending on difficulty. But, hear me out. The missions that were there in the campaign were freaking solid gold. Like, this is, from the campaign perspective, if you put the quantity aside, quality-wise, this is probably the best campaign in the entire series. If not one of the, well, maybe not the best, but it's definitely one of the best. And not only that, between the fact that you're playing with even though you're playing as the same soldier through the whole thing, playing with 3 different armies, yeah, I kind of have to wonder if that's where they got the idea to do that with Call of Duty, because, well, I believe the expansion pack was made by a different team. The devs of the original Medal of Honor did found Infinity Ward and create the original Call of Duty. And not only that, there are some battles with Allied NPCs that are way, way bigger than anything in Allied Assault. As I said before, in that game, you're usually only fighting with a couple of guys. There are a few missions in this one where it's like, holy shit, that's a lot of NPCs on the field. A lot of enemies as well. Like, the 3rd Bastogne mission is freaking huge. And that's really stuff you hadn't really seen before then and didn't see again until Call of Duty. So between the fact that they really went balls deep with this game and created an excellent single-player campaign, but having to look at it as it's short as hell and had fuck all multiplayer content. I don't remember if this game released at $30 or $40. I think I paid $30 for it. But for what you got was pretty much gold, but the amount you got was holy shit. barely anything. If I'm just looking at it from a quantity perspective, that shit would go into C tier, especially if the campaign wasn't so good. But quality-wise of that campaign, that deserves an S, so I think I'm going to round that out and put it in an A. Breakthrough, on the other hand, was the weakest of the 3. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still pretty good, but it had some issues. I think it put a bit more into the multiplayer content of it than Spearhead did, but it's still just a handful of new maps, player skins, and weapons that probably could have just been patched into the base game. But the campaign wasn't as long as Allied Assault, obviously, but it was probably twice as long as Spearhead. Going through North Africa and initially, and then having the rest of the game take place in Italy, which is another front that really hadn't been done until then. It did add some new weapons to the campaign as well. Now, the problem with it is, for some reason, they thought it would be a good idea to make it more challenging by limiting the amount of weapons and ammo you got. As a lot of times, enemies just flat out would not drop their weapons, which means you couldn't get ammo. Now, for the majority of it, it's not too big of a deal, but there are some missions where you just got fuck all ammo and had to make every shot count. And there's just no reason for it. Like, the 3rd Africa mission is probably the worst offender in that regards, because you could easily run out of ammo if you're not being careful. But once you get used to that, it's still a pretty decent experience. I'm going to say that's a B tier. It's a shame that they kind of fumbled the ball with balancing in that one, because if they hadn't, it would probably be worth putting up there an A with Spearhead. Now, Rising Sun's another one that's kind of a bit hard to judge. I think I had, that was, I think this was my second Medal of Honor game. I had the PS2 version, unlike Frontline, which I first played on the GameCube. Which is, and looking back, it's probably a good thing. Because that campaign was a little bit, it was longer than Spearhead because the missions dragged on longer, but the amount of them was about the same. 9 missions in the campaign. Which is questionable for an expansion pack. For a full release, that's kind of unacceptable. And but as I said before, they are larger and longer than Spearheads, but still, you can easily finish this in about 4 to 5 hours, tops. And the first two are just literally Pearl Harbor, with one of them being a tutorial and the second one just being a turret gun section. However, there is one saving grace for this game, or at least at the time anyway, was the multiplayer side of it. And if you notice I don't really talk about multiplayer much, that's because I usually don't give a shit, but this is one of the few times I did. And as I said before, I had the PS2 version, and it may not have been as big of a deal on the Xbox, where they were more for Xbox Live. But on the PS2, I actually had a network adapter for my fat model. And this is one of the few games I actually used it for. And while the multiplayer itself isn't that special, it's pretty much what you would expect. Being able to play that online on the console was a pretty cool experience, as I think that was the first time I'd ever done that on any console. And not only that, but playing offline had full bot support, unlike Frontline. And we had mini video game parties at my house, just breaking this thing out with about 4 of my friends, and then filling the rest of the room with bots to make. It was a pretty chaotic experience of just trying to blow each other up, but also deal with the amount of bots in the field. So again, this one's really hard to judge. For an at-the-time factor, it was decent because of its multiplayer component, but looking back, it's just, yeah, there's not a whole lot of reason to play it. Like, the campaign's alright, but fucking A, is it short. And there's really no reason to play its multiplayer now or other games, but I'm gonna say maybe a low B for that one. If it was just going off the single player, I'd put it in C. Infiltrator, on the other hand, this is a weird one. Not because it's hard to judge, just because it's a really weird game. Unlike Underground, this was a top-down shooter, which you'd think would be fine, and I guess it was, but the fact that it was a Medal of Honor game and a World War II game, it's just, because there were some missions that just got flat-out outlandish. Like, it wasn't as... I've seen worse. Like, we're not talking Wolfenstein-level craziness, but you know, any sense of, like, believability gets thrown out the window pretty damn quick. But it doesn't help that the campaign... It's just an okay game. And there's really not much to do with it once you finish the campaign. Like, I've only played through the game twice in my entire life. And both times just like, it's okay, so... It's not a particularly long game either, so... I'm just going to say it's a C tier. Pacific Assault. This is when it started getting a bit more like Call of Duty, and I want to say Call of Duty 1 had come out before Pacific Assault did, because they added aim down sights as well as larger infantry battles, and this is pretty much when they threw the whole OSS thing completely out the window. At least temporarily, because they did bring it back later on. But well, this thing did, as much as you may say, oh, it's just Call of Duty, this thing did one thing that set it apart, and I'm honestly amazed. I've never really seen it in games since, apart from maybe Quake 4 to a small degree, is the fact that apart when a medic is not available, there are no health kits in the game when there is a medic available. What you do is you have to ration the amount of times you can use the medic, and once you get low on health, call for one, which he'll come over and heal you fully. Or if you get downed, he'll resurrect you if he can get to you before you run out of time, or an enemy gets to you first and executes you. And again, every time you got healed, you would lose he would lose a med kit, though thankfully him reviving allies did not count against anything he used on you. That would have been really stupid. The one thing was, and I think this torpedoed ever bringing that mechanic back, is the fact that just the AI in general for allies was not that great, so sometimes you get down and the medic would get stuck, and then you just end up bleeding out or getting executed when they could have easily came over and revived you. So you had to make sure when you did not rely on getting revived, and actually go and heal yourself when you're low in health, and make sure you're close to him when you did so. But despite the frustration behind it, it was a pretty unique mechanic and definitely made it more immersive. The campaign was of a decent length, and the quality, for the most part, was pretty solid. There were a couple levels that were a bit stupid, but for the most part, it was a generally good experience. Multiplayer, unfortunately, I only got to play it a few times because by the time I got it, it was kind of dead, and from what I could tell, it died out pretty quick. It was basically... I guess it was just like Rising Sun, but better, but inferior to Allied Assault. It's probably why people didn't play it too long. I mean, it was decent. I had fun with it the few times I did play it, but it was nothing special. Still, but for the campaign alone, I'm going to say that's an A tier. Probably between Spearhead and the original would be a good place for it. Now, European on the Assault, on the other hand, I have some mixed feelings for. They did something a bit different by having the levels more open. It wasn't open world. You still had linear progression through, you know, standard stuff in a shooter, but going from point A to point B, the levels were more open, and you could do objectives in a different order. For the most part, there were some times where the game did force you along a linear path, but for a lot of the levels, you could say, plant this charge on this gun first, one time, and then go do some other objective, and then another time, say, do that planting objective last. So it did give you a bit of freedom. It also changed up a bit how allies work, is because it would give you a squad of soldiers to command. Unfortunately, you had to be the medic yourself. If your guys got low, you had to go and use one of your own freaking aid kits to heal them. Which might be fine if the later levels in the game, medkits got freaking sparse. And that's the biggest problem I have with the game, is the second half is just tedious. Like, the first half is decent. Like, the Africa mission and El Alamein are pretty alright, but the second half just gets really tedious, and the final mission is just flat out stupid with that final fight. And the way the story is presented is also kind of dumb, because they've managed to find this old guy to narrate it like it's a true story, and it's like, no, it's freaking not. I don't know. It also doesn't help that even though I had the PS2 version, you know, bot support and online play were pretty much dropped from it. I'm going to say this is also a C tier. Like, it's okay, but pretty bad value for what you get. Heroes. I want to say this was fairly early in the PSP's life, if I remember correctly. It wasn't the first FPS that was like Coated Arms, but this is like the first one that kind of showed that shooter games were viable on the PSP. Even though it didn't have twin stick support, there were multiple options for controls. Like you could use the face buttons to aim and the stick to move, or you could flip that and move with the face buttons and use the stick to aim, which is what I did. Though it's definitely a bit better playing it on the PS Vita, because you can map the shoulder buttons to the second stick and play it with two sticks like you traditionally would, even if the inputs are a bit janky, because it's not meant for that. So on a technical level, this game was pretty impressive. On a content level, on the other hand, is where it flops. The campaign is about 15 missions long, and they're all short. The problem is apart from a few exceptions, a lot of them play like a multiplayer match. You go and capture a point, and then go to capture another one, and enemies will come in and capture that point you just took. So it's basically a multiplayer match of King of the Hill or whatnot. Now, not all missions played out this way. There were some that played out traditionally, like the first level in the game. But the fact that so many are just relying on feeling like a multiplayer experience, especially because enemies continue to spawn infinitely, is just really off-putting. Now, there was multiplayer, full online multiplayer, and it was kind of cool, but I don't know. Just if I'm in at the time, there wasn't a whole lot of areas for playing online. Just, mobile hotspots weren't a thing as much. So if I'm going to play this thing online, I might as well play like Allied Assault or something, because I'm probably going to be doing it at home. Like, I guess if you're a university student at the time, it probably would have been pretty cool, but I don't know. I'm going to say that's a C. Airborne. Airborne was an interesting experience. I actually liked the idea of being able to drop in any area for the... Well, not quite any area, but most of the map you could drop in on. Now, there are only a couple of areas where they were quote-unquote safe to drop in, but if you were good, you could find spots to drop in that weren't safe to give you an advantage and complete objectives quicker. Like, say for example, in the first mission, the rooftops were definitely on the castle, or not the castle, the headquarters building were definitely a dangerous place to drop. But if you dropped, say, behind a searchlight and didn't screw up the landing, you could get out of that pretty quick and start shooting Nazis and be in a good place to complete the first objective first. That shit was cool. I also like how it carried on in the multiplayer. If you were playing the Airborne mode, you could drop in anywhere. Though that also had its own problems, because enemies could easily just shoot you. Enemy players could easily shoot you down as you're dropping. That mode really could have used some balance, but it was pretty fun for what it was. A couple things I didn't like. I didn't like how freaking short it was. Like, there's, I think, I want to say 6 or 7 missions in the whole game, plus a short tutorial. Like, the levels are pretty big, and you will spend probably about 30 minutes to an hour on each one, but still, like, 4 to 6 hours for a full price game is not good. But quality of said campaign, despite the length, is not the greatest, but it's good. And I enjoyed the multiplayer. I'm going to say that's also a solid B. Unfortunately, Vanguard. This was a companion game to Airborne for the older consoles as well as the Wii. And while this did have jumping mechanics, you only do it for like 3 times for the whole campaign, and the controls for it are janky at best. And plus, unlike Airborne, you can't just land anywhere on the map. You can only land somewhere in the starting area. So you kind of have to ask, what's the freaking point? And not only that, it's about as short as Airborne was. There's more levels. There's more levels, like, for numerically than Airborne, being 10 instead of 6 to 7. But a lot of them did not last for as long, and the quality of those levels was not as good. Yeah, I mean, maybe I would have been less critical on this if I hadn't paid full price for it, but when I paid for it, it's like, man, was that disappointing. It had fuck all for multiplayer as well, so bad value for just an okay experience. That's a D tier. Heroes 2, This one had also released on the Wii, and the Wii version was a bit better since it looked better, and it also had an extra mode. It had a light gun mode where you can play through the campaign, which is like it's an arcade shooter. That was pretty amusing. I only played through that once, but it's there. Gives it a bit of extra replayability. And it had pretty basic multiplayer, which I guess for the PSP and the Wii, which didn't have a whole lot of that, is fine. It was better than Vanguard as far as content-wise, even though it was also pretty short. I think it only had like 7 missions. And they were just okay. I think that was an unfortunate that was an unfortunate end to like the series for a while until they pulled a Modern Warfare Me Too. I don't know. It's better than Vanguard, but that's barely a C tier. Now, with this freaking Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare Me Too, the series got rebooted. And I think this game got a bit more hate than it deserved, I gotta be honest. Despite the fact that I hate that it did the Modern Warfare Me Too, because, you know, like we needed another one of those fucking games. I appreciated the fact that even though the story was entirely fictitious, that it was set during the Afghan War. And I also appreciate the fact that there was a bit more attention to, I guess, quote-unquote realism, since the damage model was a bit more forgiving. I also have to say it had pretty decent sound design, but that's kind of typical for a DICE game. At least I think DICE made that. Campaign was, again, kind of short, but not as short as Heroes 2 or Vanguard. And what's there was hit and miss. There were some parts that were pretty good, some parts that were kind of eh. I didn't play too much of the multiplayer, but again, it was okay. People act like this thing was terrible or it killed the series. Like, no, that was kind of Warfighter that did that. It was just an unfortunate casualty in the rush for Modern Warfare Me Too's, and it definitely was I don't want to say it was a swan song, but it was definitely a sign of bad things to come for the series, and that what we had was essentially over. But still, for the game itself, I'm gonna say it's a B. Bottom B. Now, Warfighter, on the other hand, holy shit. What were they thinking? They took everything that was good about the reboot and just threw it in the bin. The mission design for the campaign was atrocious. I don't know about the multiplayer. I never tried it. I didn't hear good things about it. The story was terrible. Like, you already had a bit of Navy SEAL jerk-off fest with the reboot. This game was just like freaking Navy SEALs jerking off to each other. That's the story. And then their wives have to expect that they're going to die, but it's okay since they're married to gods among men. And I wish I was fucking kidding, but the game basically says that. Like, I ain't going to say like the Navy SEALs aren't worthy of praise. They use the hardcore shit, but come on. Let's not jerk each other's off. Let's not have a big circle jerk. And not only that, because of how bad everything about the game, between the campaign, the story, the mediocre multiplayer, the fact that it looked outdated, it killed the series for quite a while until they tried it one more time with Above and Beyond. So this game gets a fucking F. That you stay there in that F tier. Now, speaking of things that get treated unfairly, we have the VR game. I think maybe if this game had released earlier and not after Half-Life Alyx, it probably would have been received better. As well as the fact that we haven't seen any sign of the series since. Like, don't get me wrong, Warfighter killed the series, but the poor reception to Above and Beyond kind of put the last nail in the coffin. Which, again, I don't think is fair. Yes, the game does not look as good as Half-Life Alyx. The environments are not nearly as interactable as Half-Life Alyx. However, as a shooter, I think this one was a bit better, because Half-Life Alyx was like 60% puzzle, 40% shooter. Which I know a lot of people liked. I liked Half-Life Alyx, don't get me wrong, but as a Half-Life game, I was kind of disappointed. Though mods do kind of help with that a bit. But we're not talking about Alyx, we're talking about Above and Beyond. We're only talking about Alyx because I'm making the comparison like everybody else did when this thing came out. Now, a lot of people judge this unfairly because of Alex. And I'm not going to say it didn't have problems, especially when it first came out. Having a victory screen between every load screen was a bit stupid. Thankfully, some of these issues were patched out, but it does have some issues with performance. The story and writing are just atrocious. Not as bad as Warfighter, but it's still pretty bad. However, mechanically, it's pretty solid. The shooting feels decent. Environment activity, what you can do, is alright. And this was like one of the first full-length game. I mean, apart from Alex, this was like one of the first full-length VR games. Was before we were mostly getting tech demos or short 3-hour indie games. And not only that, it's also a throwback to the older, like the first 3 Medal of Honors, back to the infiltration stuff for the most part. And I kind of appreciated that. Like, it would have been nice to get more of a modern infantry experience, but it was a nice throwback. I think being on, they had too high expectations for this as a VR game, and that's why it didn't do too well, and B, that's why the series gone back to being dormant. Which I don't want to judge it for, because it's not the game's fault, per se. I mean, by that I mean the game itself's fault, because it was a decent game. It's just, it released on a niche market with too high expectations that were hampered by people still having a honeymoon phase with Half-Life Alyx. Although, I gotta say, what the fuck is with that file size? Why does this need to be 170 gigs? Like, for real. Stalker 2 isn't as big as this game. But in any case, I'm gonna round this out by putting this in the B tier. A little better than the reboot, but not as good as the classics. Anyways, that's how I feel about the Medal of Honor series, and I do wish we'd get something from it. I don't know what we'd get, since, you know, we're not going to... a bit too late to continue the Modern Warfare Me Too stuff, and I pray they don't. But I guess this wouldn't be a bad time to go back to its roots, some more World War II stuff, because ever since the zombie craze took over the Nazi phase, we haven't really seen too much World War II games. Like, even the indie stuff we haven't seen, or budget stuff we haven't seen, fuck all. And the few things that have been coming out have been mostly multiplayer only. So, come on guys, give us something like Allied Assault or Pacific Assault. In any case, I'm going to wrap it up there. Hope you enjoyed. And I hope, if you haven't played these games, you give them a try. And if you've only played the new ones, to give the older ones a try, because they're worth it.